When you pick up an ancient historical religious text, specifically something like Surah An-Nisa from the Quran, you probably approach it with a very specific, almost hardened set of expectations.
Oh, absolutely. You're bringing all your preconceived notions to the table.
Right. If you're familiar with how these texts are usually presented to you, you think you're about to read, like, a list of domestic rules.
Yeah, you brace yourself for chapters on marriage or divorce.
Exactly. Or maybe some moral guidelines about how to be a good, obedient person in your own home. For centuries, it has essentially been treated as a kind of ancient spiritual self-help book.
That's definitely the dominant narrative, yeah.
But what if we completely shattered that illusion today? I want to ask you, sitting there listening right now, a highly provocative question. What if this material is not a collection of personal domestic rules at all?
Which is a huge mental leap for a lot of people.
Wow. It is. Because what if this text is actually the highly technical blueprint for a state-run social security system? Like a framework designed with absolute mathematical precision to ensure that no human being within its borders is left without sustenance or protection.
It completely flips the paradigm of how we even categorize ancient literature. And really, that is the central mission of our deep dive today.
So what exactly are we looking at to make this case?
We are exploring the groundbreaking socioeconomic and Quranic analysis put forward by Allama G.A. Parwez. His exhaustive work argues, using this very rigorous blend of linguistics, sociology, and jurisprudence, that these verses are actually a universal manifesto for human rights.
A manifesto, not just religious advice.
Exactly. According to his analysis, they represent a highly rational constitutional charter. So when we look at the source material we have today, Parwez is arguing that we're not looking at a list of naive blessings or mystical poetry.
Or, ancient tribal rituals.
Right. We are looking at a system of constitutional statecraft, specifically focused on economics and human dignity.
I love framing it that way. It's almost like discovering the hidden source code of a civilization.
That's a great way to put it.
But before we get deep into the mechanics of this code, I think we need to set a clear parameter for you, the listener. Because the source material we are diving into contains some incredibly strong fundamental critiques.
Oh, very strong. He doesn't hold back at all.
No, Parwez pulls no punches when dismantling traditional clerical systems. What his text describes as patriarchal, legalistic traditions that have ossified over centuries.
And at the same time, he is equally critical of modern Western secularism and capitalist framework.
Right, he's taking on everyone. So because our goal today is to give you a clear, unobstructed view of his analysis, we are going to impartially report on these frameworks.
We aren't here to endorse a specific political, religious, or social ideology.
Exactly. Nor are we here to take sides between the orthodoxy and the modernists. Our job is purely analytical. We are lifting the hood on this specific intellectual engine to show you how the author claims the gears turn.
Just looking at the mechanics.
Right. So keeping that neutrality in mind, let's jump in. If humanity has been reading this text as a moral self-help book for over a millennium, how does Parwez's shift to viewing it as a legal constitution fundamentally change the very mechanics of human rights?
Well, the author argues that this shift changes everything, and it's primarily because of a concept he calls the mafhum.
Mafhum. Okay, what does that translate to?
It translates to the real meaning, or like the conceptual root of the vocabulary. His argument is that to understand a systemic constitutional framework, you have to unlock the specific legal vocabulary it was written in.
That makes sense. Words matter.
Right. If you were to read the United States Constitution, for example, using the fluid emotional definitions of romantic poetry, you would completely misunderstand how the government operates.
You'd be totally lost.
Exactly. And Parwez argues that this is exactly the catastrophe that happened to the Quran historically. Traditional jurisprudence, which is known as fiqh, slowly confused, conflated, and spiritualized distinct legal terms over the centuries.
Because language evolves,
Yeah.
right, and empires shift.
Right. Language isn't static at all.
That makes a lot of historical sense. Words that mean one thing in a 7th century legal document can mean something entirely different in a 12th century theological debate.
Absolutely.
So can you give me a tangible example from the text? Like, how does this mafhum change a concept we think we already know?
Yeah, a prime example from the sources is how traditional scholars define the concept of orphans, or yatama in Arabic.
Okay, orphans. Usually just means kids without parents.
Exactly. For centuries, traditional fiqh viewed orphans simply as children who had lost their biological parents. And consequently, the religious injunction to care for the orphans was reduced to a matter of personal charity.
Like you give a little money, you pat an orphan on the head, and you've fulfilled your spiritual duty.
Right, you feel good about yourself and move on. But in the Mafhum, the systemic constitutional extraction Parwez performs the word refers to a much broader, highly specific socioeconomic category.
Really? Broader how?
It encompasses anyone left alone, isolated, or unsupported in the struggle of life.
Oh, wow. So not just children.
No, not at all.
Oh.
This includes a widow who has lost her financial backing, an elderly person without family, or even a worker whose industry has collapsed, leaving them destitute.
I see. So by reverting to that structural definition, Parwez shifts the concept from a narrow, localized charity case into a massive, state-level welfare directive.
Exactly. The state becomes legally obligated to provide for the isolated.
Rather than just hoping rich people feel generous on a Friday, that's a huge shift.
It is the exact mechanism of a welfare state, and the sources point out that we see this identical linguistic shift with the titular word of the surah itself, which is Nisa.
Nisa. And traditionally, that's almost universally been translated simply as the biological gender, women, right?
Right, but Parwez's analysis argues that in a constitutional context, it represents a functional demographic group.
A functional demographic. What does that mean in this context?
Well, because of the physical and historical realities of early societies, women represented a segment of the population that had historically been rendered vulnerable by patriarchal power structures.
Right. They were historically marginalized.
Exactly. Therefore, the text isn't just singling them out based on biology, it is identifying them as a protected class that requires ironclad statutory protection from the state.
To prevent systemic exploitation. I find that deeply fascinating. Because it moves the text away from a biological categorization and focuses entirely on power dynamics.
Yes, it's all about who holds the power.
And who is vulnerable to abuse. So let's apply this linguistic key to a very specific, highly debated area of law, public indecency and the justice system.
Let's do it.
The outline specifically highlights verse 4.5. You mentioned earlier that traditional jurisprudence made some fundamental, even dangerous errors in how they translated these laws.
The sources argue it was a massive structural error. According to Parwez, traditional fiqh completely confused the Arabic word fahisha in verse 4.15 with the word zina.
And zina translates specifically to the ultimate act of adultery or fornication, correct?
Yes. But in this constitutional framework, these are two entirely separate, distinct legal categories with vastly different implications. The Quran establishes a separate, fixed statutory penalty for zina, which is 100 lashes, as defined later in verse 24.2.
Okay, so zina has a very specific fixed punishment.
Right. But Parwez stresses that verse 4.15 isn't talking about that ultimate act at all. It is specifically legislating against fahisha.
Well, if it isn't adultery, what is the precise legal definition of fahisha in this framework? Because if the state is going to prosecute someone for it, the definition has to be incredibly sharp.
Parwez defines fahisha as preliminary acts of extreme public indecency, uninhibited public behavior, and the blatant societal pathways that actively lead to corruption.
Oh, so it's about public behavior.
Exactly. We are not talking about private, victimless infractions behind closed doors. The text is targeting behavior that actively disrupts the social order, degrades the public square, and pollutes the psychological environment of the community.
It's about the public broadcast of indecency.
Yes, the public broadcast is the key issue here.
But, historically we know that vague accusations of indecency or immodesty have been used as a prime weapon to control vulnerable populations, particularly women.
Oh, without a doubt. It's a classic tool of oppression.
Right. If a patriarchal society wants to silence a woman or ruin her reputation or strip her of her property, they just accuse her of being indecent. It's a tale as old as time.
It really is.
So how does Parwez argue that this specific constitutional system accounts for that vulnerability? Does it build in safeguards?
This is where the analysis highlights the system's brilliance. It builds an evidentiary shield around the vulnerable. To even bring a case against a woman for fahisha in this legal framework, the state requires a standard of proof that borders on the impossible.
Borders on the impossible. What's the standard?
4 eyewitnesses.
Wait, let me stop you there and really think about the mechanics of that. 4 eyewitnesses to an act of public indecency.
Yes, 4 independent witnesses.
Not circumstantial evidence, not hearsay, not a suspicious text message. 4 independent people who saw the exact same physical act at the exact same time.
Exactly at the same time.
That is an incredibly high bar. I mean, it almost seems designed to prevent prosecution rather than encourage it.
Well, the author argues it is purposefully high for exactly that reason. The primary goal of the system is to completely eliminate character assassination.
Because it's just too hard to prove maliciously.
Right. Think about the logistics. If you require 4 people to have simultaneously witnessed the exact same act of extreme indecency, you eradicate the possibility of malicious rumors.
Or slander, or patriarchal control being used as a legal weapon.
Exactly. 1 angry ex-husband cannot testify against her. 2 gossiping neighbors cannot build a case.
The system mathematically protects the woman's dignity from whispers and suspicion.
Yes. The act would have to be so brazen, so unapologetically public, that 4 random citizens witnessed it.
So the law is actually functioning as a wall to keep the state and society out of people's private lives.
That's the exact function, yes.
But let's say, theoretically, someone acts so brazenly that the standard is met. 4 witnesses step forward, they testify, and the extreme public indecency is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt in a court of law. What is the penalty?
And this is where everyone usually braces themselves.
Right, because based on how ancient Middle Eastern texts are usually portrayed in modern media, I think most of us brace ourselves for something incredibly violent or harsh.
But this is where Parwez's analysis of the constitutional nature of the text really diverges from orthodox assumptions. The penalty mandated in verse 4.15 for a woman convicted of this is not corporal punishment.
It's not physical violence.
Not at all. The statutory penalty is Imsaku fil buyut, which translates to home confinement. The state suspends their societal liberties and restricts their public movement.
Wow. I want to dig into how a 7th century state or even a future society operating on this blueprint actually enforces that.
Right, because it's not a dungeon.
Yeah, we aren't talking about putting an electronic ankle monitor on someone. It sounds like a sociological quarantine. Like the community essentially says, you have lost your right to participate in the public square.
Sociological quarantine is the perfect way to conceptualize it. The logic, according to the sources, is purely systemic rather than vindictive.
Systemic how?
Well, if an individual is spreading extreme behavioral corruption in the public square, the most rational, nonviolent solution is to remove them from the public square.
You halt the spread of the contagion.
Exactly. You confine them to their home, ensuring they are still sustained and protected, but their ability to influence the wider society is legally suspended.
But I imagine this interpretation caused massive friction with traditional clerics over the centuries.
Oh, massive friction. It was highly controversial.
Because a lot of later empires and dynasties leaned heavily into violent public corporal punishments to assert state dominance. If this constitution says the punishment is simply stay home, how did the later, more orthodox legal systems justify the harsher punishments they eventually adopted?
The author spends a significant amount of time dismantling exactly how they justified it. Many traditional clerics and jurists looked at verse 4.15, saw that the punishment was only home confinement, and claimed that this verse was abrogated.
Abrogated, like canceled.
Yes, the Arabic term is mansuk. They argued that because it seemed too lenient to them, or because it conflicted with outside traditions they had imported, this specific verse was somehow canceled out or overwritten by later rulings.
Are you kidding? They just claimed a piece of the Constitution was deleted because it didn't fit their political or patriarchal preferences.
That's exactly Parwez's critique.
You can't just cross out a line in a supreme legal document and pretend it doesn't exist anymore.
And Parwez argues forcefully that you absolutely cannot. His thesis insists that a permanent constitutional document cannot have its laws casually deleted, suspended, or abrogated by later clerics.
It ruins the whole point of a constitution.
Right. He views the concept of mansuk abrogation as a catastrophic flaw that destroys the integrity of a timeless legal framework. If humans can decide which divine laws are active and which are canceled, the document ceases to be supreme.
It just becomes a suggestion box for whatever empire is currently in power.
Exactly. Therefore, he maintains that verse 4.15 stands as permanent, unalterable law for the crime of fahisha committed by women.
Okay, but the architecture of this law gets even more intricate because the very next verse, 4.16 shifts the jurisdiction entirely, right?
Yeah.
Verse 4.15 dealt with the vulnerable demographic. What happens in 4.16?
Verse 4.16 utilizes the Arabic dual pronoun, al-Thani.
Yeah, dual pronoun, so it's talking about two people.
Yes. In the rigorous linguistic analysis Parwez provides, this grammatical shift means the text is now referring to two men, or the mutual consensual involvement of a man and a woman committing these acts of indecency together.
Okay, so the jurisdiction shifts from the isolated female offender to mutual or male offenders.
Right. You're dealing with a different dynamic of power and complicity here.
So how does the penalty change for mutual offenders or men? Does it revert to a strict, unchangeable punishment?
This is where Parwez highlights a brilliant piece of legislative design. Unlike the supreme crimes, which have fixed, mathematically precise limits that can never be altered, which are known as had the penalty in verse 4.16 is left intentionally open-ended.
Open-ended. What does the text say?
The text instructs the state to administer appropriate harassment or punitive action, using the word aziyat.
I have to admit, reading that initially, it feels a bit vague for a supreme legal code. Punish them appropriately, leave a lot of room for interpretation.
It does seem that way at first glance.
Right. Why wouldn't a perfect constitutional blueprint just give a precise penalty for everything?
Well, the author posits that it's not vague, it's highly flexible, and that flexibility is a hallmark of advanced statecraft.
How so?
If a constitution locks in a hyper-specific penalty for every minor infraction, it becomes brittle. It breaks as society evolves.
I see.
By leaving the penalty for aziyat open, the text grants the contemporary state, say, a 21st century legislative assembly in London, or a 25th century colony on Mars, the constitutional authority to determine the appropriate penal measures.
Based on their specific era.
Yes, their cultural context and their socioeconomic realities. It empowers human intellect to actively legislate as long as they stay within the broad ethical boundaries set by the text.
I see. So a legislative body in 1826 might have decided the penalty for mutual public indecency was a week in the town stocks, while a modern assembly in 2026 might decide it's 500 hours of community service and a severe financial penalty.
Exactly. It allows the law to breathe. It adapts without breaking.
That's incredibly smart. But this leads to a vital question about human nature. People make mistakes. What if the offenders realize they messed up?
Right. What if they want to change?
Yeah, what if they genuinely regret what they did? Does this rigid constitutional system have a mechanism for mercy, or is it purely punitive?
It absolutely has a mechanism for mercy, and Parwez argues it is one of the most sophisticated aspects of the entire framework. This brings us seamlessly to the author's analysis of verses 4.17 and 4.18, where the text introduces the highly misunderstood concept of tauba.
Oh, tauba. If you grew up around any Orthodox religious tradition, you know the word tauba. It almost universally translates to repentance.
Right, the standard religious definition.
The standard operating procedure is, you do something wrong, you feel guilty, you say a specific prayer, you ask the universe for forgiveness, and your slate is wiped clean. It's deeply personal and entirely spiritual. How does Parwez challenge that?
He challenges it by stripping away the mysticism entirely. He argues that the traditional passive interpretation, like the mechanical chanting of a phrase like astaghfirullah while feeling bad in your heart, is a severe distortion of the mafhum.
So it's not just chanting a prayer.
Not at all. In the author's systemic extraction, tauba is redefined into a proactive, state-level legal action. The actual linguistic root of the word tauba means to return.
To return. Okay, how does that work in a legal framework?
It acts as a reciprocal mechanism. The individual returns from their destructive path by ceasing the crime, and in response, the state returns by withdrawing the punishment.
Oh, wow.
It is fundamentally about course correction and tangible damage control, a concept the text refers to as talafi.
So it's not about how sad you feel, it's about the kinetic actions you take to fix the situation. You don't just repent, you repair.
Exactly. You have to repair.
But how does the legal system judge when someone is genuinely returning from a mistake versus when they are just trying to game the system to avoid jail time?
The author points out that the text lays out incredibly precise psychological and legal diagnostic criteria to differentiate offenders. It forces the judicial system to distinguish between unintentional slips and calculated habitual crimes.
Okay, let's unpack those criteria.
Verse 4.17 deals specifically with crimes committed bijahalatin. This term covers acts done out of sudden emotional provocation, a temporary loss of cognitive control, or momentary ignorance.
In modern legal terms, we would call that a crime of passion, right?
Yes, very similar.
It's the difference between a bar fight that gets completely out of hand because someone's amygdala got hijacked versus a calculated, premeditated bank heist that took 6 months to plan.
Precisely the distinction Parwez is highlighting. If an individual commits a crime bija halatin and they experience genuine, immediate remorse, the Quranic term used is min qarib, meaning soon, or at the exact moment their rational awareness returns.
Okay, so immediate remorse.
Right. And then they execute practical, material reform to fix what they broke, which is called Ayah. If all those conditions are met, the text states that the system must grant institutional forgiveness.
I want to highlight that word, must. It's not a suggestion for the judge to be nice today.
No, it's not optional.
It is constitutionally mandated leniency. The judicial system is legally ordered to withdraw punitive actions. What fascinates me is how perfectly this 1,400-year-old diagnostic criteria maps onto the modern legal doctrine of mens rea.
The requirement of criminal intent.
Exactly.
And the author argues that this is proof of the text's advanced sociological architecture. It anticipates modern restorative justice by centuries. The entire mechanism of bija halatin and tauba is designed to protect the vulnerable first-time offender.
Because you don't want to destroy a kid's life over one mistake.
Exactly. If a 19-year-old makes one terrible, emotionally charged mistake, you don't want to throw them into a maximum security prison where they will simply be traumatized and trained to become a hardened career criminal.
You want them to repair the damage, learn the lesson, and be seamlessly reintegrated into society. The system prioritizes rehabilitation over revenge.
Yes, that is incredibly rational.
But the system has to have a defense mechanism, right? Because what about the career criminal?
Oh, it handles them very differently.
Like the guy who runs a fraud ring,
Yeah.
calculates his crimes, knows exactly how much damage he is causing, gets caught by the authorities, and then suddenly bursts into tears in front of the judge shouting, "I repent, I offer my tauba." How does the Constitution handle the exploitation of mercy?
The author's analysis shows that the system perfectly anticipates that exact exploitation. Verse 4.18 explicitly commands the state not to accept the tauba of habitual, calculated criminals.
So the judge just rejects it.
Constitutionally rejects it. If an individual calculates their offenses, repeatedly disrupts the social order, ignores all previous opportunities for reform, and only uses repentance as a verbal shield when they are finally cornered by the law, their plea is thrown out.
And what happens to them?
For these individuals, the text mandates painful punishment, which Parwez maps to rigorous penal confinement or maximum security isolation. The state's security and the protection of the innocent must absolutely overrule the criminal's last-minute plea.
The logic there is impenetrable. You cannot use the law of mercy to destroy the law of justice.
Exactly.
But this leads me to a scenario that I think a lot of people listening will immediately wonder about. What about deathbed confessions?
Ah, yes, the ultimate loophole.
Right. Across so many different cultures, religions, and even Hollywood movies, there is this pervasive idea that saying sorry right before you take your last breath clears your slate. It is the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card at the very last possible second. Does Parwez's interpretation of this constitutional system allow for that kind of theological loophole?
The author's answer is an unequivocal no. And this is where Parwez introduces one of his most profound concepts, the law of requital.
The law of requital.
Yes, which acts as the social physics of this entire framework. To understand why a deathbed confession is rejected, you have to understand how Parwez argues the universe evaluates human action.
The social physics of the framework. I'm captivated by that phrase. How does the law of requital actually operate?
Parwez posits that under the law of requital, every single action a human takes causes a tangible material effect in the real world. It is the sociological equivalent of Newton's third law of motion.
Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Exactly. If you commit a physical crime, you steal someone's property, you physically harm someone, you destroy a community's resources, you have introduced actual kinetic damage to the societal fabric.
You broke something real.
Right. Therefore, wiping away the stain of that crime requires the execution of a superior physical corrective action to neutralize the damage. You have to actively, materially repair what you broke.
Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly with a hypothetical. If in a fit of anger I smash the window of your business, tauba in this system isn't me sitting in my room feeling guilty and apologizing to the sky.
No, that achieves nothing materially.
Right. True tauba under the law of requital is me going to the hardware store, buying the glass with my own money, sweeping up the shards I caused, and installing a new window for you. I have to physically reverse the kinetic damage I caused.
That is the exact mechanism. Now, apply that physical requirement to a deathbed apology.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going.
By definition, a person on their deathbed has run out of time. They have zero physical capacity, zero kinetic energy, and zero opportunity left to actively repair the societal harm they caused over their lifetime.
They cannot rebuild the window.
Exactly. Therefore, the author argues their verbal repentance is biologically, sociologically, and mathematically meaningless.
That is a staggering conceptual shift. It completely strips away the magical thinking that often infects religious philosophy and replaces it with the hard, unforgiving laws of cause and effect.
Yes, it grounds morality in physical reality.
You can't cheat the system at the very end because you literally lack the physical capacity to undo your actions. Mere words cannot reverse physics.
That is precisely Parwez's grand thesis on this matter. The natural socio-legal order rejects the deathbed apology because accepting it would violate the fundamental physics of cause and effect upon which the universe is built.
So, if this system is so incredibly nuanced about intent, so deeply focused on restorative justice for first-time offenders, and so flexible about allowing future assemblies to determine penalties for things like indecency, are there any absolute hard lines?
What do you mean by hard lines?
Like, does this Constitution have a bedrock of unchangeable laws that no future society is allowed to alter? Everything can't be flexible, right?
The author outlines that there is indeed a bedrock. And this brings his analysis to what he calls the 4 pillars of supreme justice.
4 pillars. Okay.
In this massive constitutional framework, out of all the thousands of possible infractions, misdemeanors, and felonies a human being could potentially commit, the text only prescribes fixed, mathematically unchangeable statutory punishments known as HAD for exactly 4 specific categories of crime.
Everything else is left to the legislative consultation and flexibility of the society.
Yes, but these 4 pillars are permanently locked in.
Only 4. Out of all the complexities of human civilization, only 4 crimes get the ultimate, unchangeable penalty from the foundational code. What are these 4 existential threats?
According to Parwez's synthesis, these 4 crimes are directed against the absolute foundational pillars of any surviving civilization. Pillar 1 is the protection of life, which covers premeditated murder and homicide.
Okay, that's obvious. What's 2?
Pillar 2 is the protection of wealth, which covers larceny, severe theft, and economic sabotage that threatens the Nizam-e-Rububiyat, the economic engine of sustenance we will discuss shortly.
Got it. And 3?
Pillar 3 is the protection of the state, which covers treason, subversion, and armed rebellion against the constitutional order.
Okay, let's pause and look at those 3. Life, wealth, and the state. If you look at the supreme penal code of almost any modern functioning nation today, those 3 are at the absolute apex of their legal priorities.
Without a doubt.
You kill someone, you destroy the economic system, or you try to violently overthrow the government, you face the harshest penalties available. That makes total logical sense. What is the 4th pillar?
The 4th pillar is the protection of chastity and reputation, known in Arabic as ismat.
Chastity and reputation.
Yes. This category covers false, malicious accusations of unchastity, what we would call extreme defamation, as well as extreme statutory sexual offenses.
Wait, I want to make sure I am grasping the magnitude of what the author is claiming here. In this constitutional framework, defamation, the destruction of someone's reputation, and sexual ethics are placed on the exact same legal tier as armed treason against the state and premeditated murder.
Yes. In the author's analysis, they hold the exact same constitutional weight.
That is, I don't think we see human dignity elevated to that level, even in the most progressive legal systems today.
We definitely don't.
To explicitly state that destroying a vulnerable person's reputation through slander is a crime on par with bombing a government building, that completely reframes how we value human life.
It is a massive paradigm shift. Parwez argues that this categorization entirely removes chastity, modesty, and reputation from the flimsy realm of personal religious sin or cultural preference.
It makes it a state issue.
Exactly. By placing it alongside treason and murder, the text elevates the protection of individual dignity to a matter of absolute national security.
Wow. National security.
His argument is sociological. A society simply cannot survive. It will structurally collapse if the character, dignity, and psychological safety of its vulnerable individuals can be assassinated by the powerful without severe statutory consequence.
I follow the logic perfectly, but we have to address the historical elephant in the room here.
Okay.
Historically, concepts like chastity, modesty, or ismat have been weaponized almost exclusively as a burden placed on women. In patriarchal societies, it's always the woman who has to be modest, the woman whose reputation is considered fragile, the woman who gets blamed if society's sexual ethics degrade.
Yes, that is the unfortunate historical reality.
Oh. How does Parwez argue that this specific system handles that historical double standard? Because if it just enforces male dominance, it fails as a universal manifesto.
The author argues that the text actively eradicates that double standard by making the requirement of ismat universally applicable and rigidly non-gendered.
Non-gendered.
Yes. The expert analysis of the text deeply debunks the idea that moral integrity is a female burden. Parwez shows that it is a universal socio-civilizational pillar applicable equally and forcefully to both men and women.
Does the analysis provide specific evidence from the text to support that? Because, it is very easy for a legal document to preach equality in its preamble, but proving it in the application of the law is another thing entirely.
Parwez uses the text's own historical case studies to prove this universality. He specifically highlights two major historical narratives utilized in the Quran to define ismat.
Which narratives?
The story of Prophet Mary and the story of Prophet Joseph. In the author's sociological reading, both of these figures found themselves isolated in highly adverse, corrupted, and uninhibited environments.
Okay, let's look at Mary first.
Mary was navigating the deeply patriarchal, hyper-legalistic, and often corrupt clerical society of her time, which was actively trying to destroy her reputation.
Right, she was incredibly vulnerable.
And Joseph, on the other hand, was an enslaved foreigner, completely vulnerable, placed inside the high-power, politically elite house of an Egyptian minister.
Ah, right, the classic story of Joseph and the minister's wife, often known as Zuleika in later traditions. She holds all the political and economic power, and she propositions him.
Exactly. And the author focuses heavily on this dynamic. Joseph's fierce protection of his ismat, his virtue, his physical integrity, and his ethical boundaries when he was actively propositioned and threatened by a woman who held absolute life-and-death power over him proves a vital constitutional point.
What's the point?
It proves that moral resilience and strict sexual ethics are a fundamental requirement for men, just as they are for women. It proves that maintaining strict ethical boundaries is entirely non-gendered.
So it's about self-control across the board.
Right. Parwez argues the text is stating that a stable civilization requires absolute self-control from everyone, regardless of their gender or their power status, without any exception.
I think that is a profound way to read those historical narratives.
Yeah.
It moves them from simple morality tales to legal precedents, proving that character isn't just a female issue.
It's a human issue.
Exactly. But I want to push into that idea of equality a little deeper, because as we just noted, talking about ideological equality is the easiest thing in the world.
Yeah.
Every politician on a campaign trail, every cleric giving a sermon, every corporate leader talks about equality. It's cheap.
Talk is very cheap.
So how does Parwez argue this framework actually enforces equality in the unforgiving real world?
To answer that, the author's analysis takes us to verse 2.228 and the critical concept of bil maruf.
Bil maruf, what does that mean here?
Parwez makes a very sharp, almost cynical distinction here about how societies operate. He notes that religious and capitalist societies love to preach ideological equality from the pulpit or the podium.
Oh yeah, we are all equal in the eyes of God, or all equal under the flag.
Exactly. But Parwez argues that without hard structural legal backing, that preaching is merely an anesthetic. It means absolutely nothing in the material world.
It's just pretty words designed to keep people docile on a Sunday or a Friday, while the economic reality crushes them the rest of the week.
Exactly the author's critique. The linguistic shift he applies here is profound. Traditionally, the phrase bil maruf in this verse has been translated by Orthodox clerics as a vague, toothless moral recommendation for kindness or good behavior between spouses.
Like, just be nice to your wife.
Right. But Parwez's systemic extraction refuses that soft translation. He translates bil maruf into hard, statutory legal equality, what he calls kanunin, meaning by force of law.
Okay, statutory legal equality. So Parwez is saying we are moving from theoretical poetry to enforceable law. Can you break down an example of how he illustrates the difference between spiritual equality and statutory equality?
Yeah, Parwez uses a very famous, powerful, classic historical metaphor to illustrate this exact dichotomy. The story of Mahmud and Ayahs.
Mahmud and Ayahs.
Right. Mahmud of Ghazni was a deeply powerful historical king, and Ayaz was his famously loyal slave. The author points out that traditionalists will often use this story to praise the spiritual equality of their religion.
How do they use it?
They will paint a picture. When the call to prayer echoes through the city, Mahmud, the absolute monarch, and Ayaz, the lowly slave, go into the mosque and stand shoulder to shoulder in the exact same row. They bow together.
So they're equals in the mosque.
Right. Look, the clerics say, "Behold the beautiful spiritual equality." Inside the mosque, there's no difference between the monarch and the servant.
And to be fair, it is a striking image. The idea that before the divine, human hierarchies dissolve, it sounds perfect.
Parwez acknowledges it is a beautiful image until the prayer ends, because his analysis focuses on what happens the moment they step outside the mosque.
What happens?
Once they cross the threshold back into society, the brutal socioeconomic reality instantly resets. Ayaz, the spiritual equal man, still has to bend down, pick up Mahmud's shoes, and carry them for him. Mahmud returns to his palace to control the wealth, and Ayaz returns to his subjugation.
Wow. That cuts right to the bone. The spiritual equality they experienced inside the building did absolutely nothing to change the economic subjugation outside the building.
The author argues it is worse than doing nothing. The illusion of equality inside the mosque actually acts as a psychological tool to keep Ayaz compliant with his slavery outside.
Because he feels just equal enough not to revolt.
Precisely. Parwez argues that the constitutional mandate of Bil Ma'ruf exists specifically to violently abolish this outside-the-mosque dichotomy.
But demanding legal enforcement.
Yes. It legally demands that the equality acknowledged in spiritual theory must be codified, enforced, and protected in the societal operations and economic laws of the state.
So how does Parwez apply this Bil Ma'ruf concept to gender dynamics? Because we are talking about Surah An-Nisa, which we established focuses heavily on the protection of women as a historically vulnerable demographic. How does statutory equality actually dismantle political patriarchy in this system?
The author connects this directly to the overarching economic engine of the Quranic system, which he calls Nizam-i-Rububiyat.
Nizam-i-Rububiyat.
It means the system of universal sustenance or universal nourishment. This is the socio-economic core of his entire thesis. This system absolutely requires the equitable distribution of wealth and strict laws of inheritance to actively prevent the concentration of capital in the hands of a few elites.
Okay, so it's heavily anti-monopoly.
Very much so. But Parwez argues that economic equality is impossible without political equality. Therefore, Nizam-i-Rububiyat dictates that political and legislative power cannot be concentrated exclusively in the hands of men.
Because if men hold all the political and legislative power, they will inevitably write laws that protect male capital, male interests, and male supremacy. It's basic human nature, right? Power protects itself.
Exactly. And this is where Parwez's analysis of Bil Ma'ruf offers a scathing critique of what we might call modern political charity.
Political charity, like tokenism.
Yes. He observes that in many modern systems, even supposedly progressive ones, patriarchal assemblies will patronizingly gift a small percentage of reserved parliamentary seats to women.
Okay.
The author compares this directly to the concept of kanyadan in regional cultures, which essentially means giving alms or charity to a beggar. He argues that this treats women's political representation as a minor concession granted by benevolent, powerful men rather than an inherent right.
Right, like, we'll give you 10% of the seats so you feel included, and the international community praises us. But make no mistake, we are still running the show and writing the budgets.
Parwez states that Bil Ma'ruf utterly and constitutionally rejects this patriarchal charity. It legally demands that women, who make up half the population and half the intellectual capacity of the species, must possess the statutory right and the merit-based opportunity to contest, legislate, and govern completely independently.
So they have to be true partners in the system.
They must be active, equal architects of the law, not passive recipients of male benevolence. His thesis is blunt. Without women having equal, legally protected, and active standing in the legislative assembly, the Nizam-i-Rububiyat, the system that ensures universal nourishment and prevents poverty, is functionally impossible to achieve.
If you strip away the 1400-year-old origins, that is an aggressively modern, almost radical political platform.
It was incredibly radical for its time and still is today.
It's not just about letting women vote. It's about mandating that women are essential designers of the socioeconomic system itself. But this brings us to what I think is the most fascinating and definitely the most controversial synthesis in Parwez's entire analysis.
Okay, where are we going?
Well, because if a society actually achieves this level of statutory equality, and if it strictly enforces these laws of ismat and public decency, what happens to the energy of that society? How does a civilization actually grow and achieve dominance?
Ah, yes, the civilizational vitality aspect.
Right. To answer this, Parwez turns away from theology entirely and looks toward 20th century anthropology. Specifically, he heavily cites the exhaustive research of a Cambridge scholar named Dr. J.D. Unwin.
Yes, this is where the structural blueprint of the law meets the biological reality of human beings. To prove that these Quranic laws aren't just arbitrary moral tests, Parwez integrates the findings of Dr. Unwin.
And Unwin wrote a massive book, right?
Yes, a monumental, highly empirical book in 1934 called Sex and Culture. Unwin was not a theologian. He was an Oxford and Cambridge-educated anthropologist who spent years meticulously studying 80 primitive tribes and 16 historical civilizations.
80 tribes and 16 civilizations. That's a huge data set.
It is. He wanted to map out what we can accurately call the social physics of human energy. He wanted to solve a historical mystery. Why do some civilizations rise to incredible intellectual, scientific, and architectural heights, while others perpetually remain primitive or rise briefly, only to inevitably collapse?
Okay, so he's looking at the Romans, the Babylonians, indigenous cultures across the globe. He is looking for the common denominator of civilizational success. What did Dr. Unwin find? What was the secret variable?
The variable he discovered shocked even him. Unwin found a complete mathematically direct correlation between a civilization's cultural, scientific, and intellectual elevation and the strictness of the regulations it enforced upon prenuptial sexual relations and public decency.
Wait, really?
All right.
Let me make sure I'm hearing this right. The way a society legislates and handles sex directly dictates its scientific and intellectual output.
Yeah.
How does that work mechanically? It sounds almost puritanical on the surface.
It sounds puritanical until you look at the physics of it, which Parwez explores through the law of energy conservation and a psychological process called amalitacid.
Amalitacid. What is the English translation for that?
It translates to sublimation.
A sublimation. I know that term from early psychology. Freud talked about this extensively, the idea of redirecting base, animalistic desires into higher pursuits like art, architecture, or complex work.
It is very similar to that concept, but Parwez and Unwin are applying it not just to the individual, but macro level to an entire civilization. Think of the baseline human biological drive, the desire for reproduction and sexual gratification as an immense, naturally occurring energy source.
Probably the biggest energy source we have.
Exactly. It is perhaps the most powerful kinetic drive in the human species.
I'm going to use an analogy here to help visualize this because the mechanics are fascinating. Think of that biological energy like a massive, raging, naturally flowing river.
Okay, a river.
If a society just lets that river flow wherever it wants, without any rules or boundaries, the water just spreads out. It creates wide, shallow swamps. It might water a few plants here and there, but ultimately, the kinetic energy dissipates. It just follows the path of least resistance, which is gravity.
That is an excellent visualization of a society without sexual ethics. The energy dissipates, but what happens if you build a dam?
Well, you build a massive, structurally sound dam across that river. You severely restrict the water. You create rigid, unyielding boundaries. And because the water can't just flow freely anymore, all that kinetic water pressure builds up behind the wall.
It pressurizes.
Right. And once you have that immense pressure, you can channel it specifically through narrow turbines to generate electricity. You can use that conserved energy to light up a whole city, power factories, and build a metropolis.
The energy of the river wasn't wasted and it wasn't destroyed.
Exactly. It was systematically restricted, pressurized, and redirected to create a higher form of power.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the author's explanation of amalitacid. Parwez argues that the Quranic socio-legal framework laws like the extreme burden of proof for fahisha, the home confinement, the protection of hismat, acts as the societal dam.
So it's not about hating human nature.
Not at all. Restricting sexual energy, confining it strictly to equitable, legally bound, monogamous relationships isn't about prudishness, and it certainly isn't born from a hatred of the human body. Parwez argues it is a quantifiable, necessary law of social physics.
When a society imposes strict, unbreakable boundaries on biological impulses,
That immense energy is conserved and sublimated. It is systematically redirected away from constant, low-level animalistic gratification and violently channeled into higher cognitive functions.
It quite literally generates the intellectual electricity required to build a civilization.
Yes, the author uses a specific term for this resulting power. He calls it maximizing a nation's quwwat fikr amal, its ultimate power of thought and action.
So what did Unwin see in his data when the dam wasn't there? When a society, like one of those 80 tribes or a collapsing empire, just let the river flow without boundaries and embraced total sexual liberation.
Unwin's data showed the baseline of decay, societies that allowed absolute prenuptial sexual freedom, where men and women were free to satisfy their physical desires without legal or cultural limits, perpetually remained at the lowest, most primitive tiers of development.
Wow.
Unwin called them zoistic or animalistic cultures. Parwez argues that unrestricted access to base desires reduces humans to a purely biological existence.
I mean, it makes sense. If you can get a hit of dopamine whenever you want without any effort, commitment, or societal structure, the brain stops trying to build anything complex.
Right. The society loses its capacity for deferred gratification, and eventually it loses its capacity for rational, long-term thought.
Because the population is entirely focused on baseline, immediate gratification. They aren't thinking about building aqueducts or mapping the stars or writing constitutional law because their immediate biological needs are constantly and easily satiated.
Correct. And Parwez highlights a terrifying societal progression that happens next. When that intellectual vitality and ability to defer gratification is lost, the civilization eventually loses its grasp on cause and effect reasoning.
Because they're no longer engaging in complex systemic thought.
Exactly. They can no longer understand why complex things happen to them. They lose the ability to do science.
If a society loses cause and effect reasoning, what fills that intellectual void? Because, I mean, the human brain always wants an explanation for why it's suffering or why the crops failed.
The author points out that the void is immediately filled by superstition and fatalism. Parwez paints a very vivid, historically verifiable picture here. When a society's intellectual energy depletes, they regress into a state of blind imitation, which the text calls taqlid.
Taqlid.
Because they can no longer control their own societal destiny or understand the scientific mechanics of the world, they start desperately attributing magical powers to inanimate objects to save them.
Like reaching for magic to fix real-world problems.
Exactly. They regress into ancestral worship. They start building shrines to dead saints, tying wish threads to trees, or believing that carrying certain stones will magically cure their diseases or solve their economic problems.
That's fascinating.
Parwez scathingly refers to populations trapped in this stage as living corpses.
Living corpses. That is an incredibly bleak but highly logical progression to track. You go from absolute biological anarchy, which leads to a loss of cognitive focus, which degrades into a loss of scientific cause and effect reasoning, which sends the society straight into superstition and inevitable civilizational collapse.
It's a domino effect.
Does Parwez offer a specific historical blueprint to prove this theory?
He uses the historical blueprint of the early Arabs to definitively prove this thesis. He points out that before the implementation of the Quranic social order, the fractured tribes of the Arabian Peninsula operated with widespread, unrestrained sexual liberties and deep patriarchal exploitation.
And what was their civilizational status?
They had zero global civilizational footprint. They were entirely marginalized, superstitious, and scientifically stagnant.
They were just disparate tribes wandering the desert, fighting endless blood feuds over water and camels, completely ignored by the massive superpowers of the day.
Exactly. But Parwez notes that the moment they adopted these specific Quranic injunctions, the moment they built the dam, everything changed.
They institutionalized strict sexual ethics.
Yes. They legally eradicated extreme public indecency, and through Bil Ma'ruf, they demanded statutory equality and the protection of vulnerable demographics. By strictly regulating their biological opportunities, they conserved and consolidated their national energy.
And that sublimated power, their newly generated quwwati fikr amal, allowed them to rapidly erupt from the desert.
And overthrow the massive, globally dominant but structurally decaying empires of Rome and Iran in a remarkably short period. They achieved unprecedented cultural, architectural, and scientific heights precisely because they maximized their power of thought and action through strict socio-legal boundaries.
That is an incredible synthesis. So if we take everything we have unpacked today, what does this all mean for you, this single listener sitting there absorbing this.
It's highly relevant today.
If you are looking at the trajectory of our modern global society, this analysis is essentially a masterclass in human capital management and civilizational survival. Parwez is arguing that these ancient laws are not a list of chores to get into heaven. They are a strategic, mathematical blueprint for managing a nation's psychological and creative energy.
That's the core takeaway, yes.
His analysis attempts to prove that you cannot have continuous civilizational momentum if you are economically exploiting half your population, or if you surrender your culture to absolute biological anarchy. You have to actively conserve and channel your energy, or you will dissipate into the swamps of history.
If we synthesize all the threads we've discussed today, from the linguistic keys to the protection of Ismat to the anthropological data, we arrive at the core Mustaqila Qadar, which Parwez defines as the permanent value established in this deep dive.
And what is that permanent value?
Human dignity, the protection of the vulnerable, and hard social equity are not abstract moral concepts. They are not just nice poetic ideas to preach from a pulpit while ignoring them in the streets. According to this framework, they are quantifiable, unforgiving laws of social physics required for a society to survive the law of requital.
They are survival mechanics.
Yes. The ultimate, absolute metric of any civilization's health is the statutory protection of its most vulnerable demographics. If the system fails the vulnerable, if it allows their wealth to be hoarded or their dignity to be slandered, the society will inevitably collapse under its own structural rot.
We started this deep dive by asking if we could shatter the illusion of this text, and I think looking at it through Parwez's lens does exactly that. The system we've unpacked today, this constitutional charter from Surah An-Nisa, protects the individuals from slander. It demands economic and legal equity, it expertly manages human biological energy, and it mandates actionable kinetic course correction over empty apologies.
It's a massive blueprint.
It is. But laying out this massive, flawless architectural blueprint raises a massive, lingering question. We have the Constitution. We know the rights. But who builds the dam?
Ah, the enforcer.
Right. How does this constitutional framework define the actual authority, what Parwez calls the markaz, that must exist in the real world to enforce these laws, collect the wealth for the Nizami Rubiyat, and guarantee these human rights? A law without an enforcer is just a suggestion.
Very true.
That exact question of state authority is where we go in the next deep dive.
And as we close today's analysis, I want to leave you with one final, highly provocative thought to mull over regarding Parwez and Unwin's theories.
Yeah.
We've seen the anthropological research. We've explored the argument that a society's intellectual and creative output is directly mathematically tied to how strictly it legislates equality and how rigidly it restrains base biological impulses.
Right.
Now look at the world around you today. Look at the digital media landscape, the social algorithms, the hypersexualized marketing, and the massive socioeconomic disparities running our modern societies.
It's pretty stark.
Ask yourself, are these modern systems designed to elevate our power of thought and action? Are they trying to build turbines? Or are they perfectly calibrated to keep us constantly distracted, perpetually gratified, intellectually stagnant, and ultimately primitive?
Are we building this civilization, or are we the ones cheering as the dam breaks? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.